Good evening. I'm Dr. Carla Pfeffer, Director of Women's and Gender Studies here at the University of South Carolina. Thank you so much for joining us for the 27th Annual Adrenée Glover Freeman Memorial Lecture in African American Women's and Gender Studies. This year's lecture is a part of the College of Arts and Sciences Justice Theme Semester. It's been made possible through the generous support of the Glover family, the College of Arts and Sciences, and broadcast rights from PBS, with a shout out to our local PBS station, SCE-TV. I want to thank key organizers who have worked so hard to make virtual delivery of this year's lecture possible. Our wonderful administrative assistant here in Women's and Gender Studies, Ms. Miranda Frederick, and dedicated staff in the Division of Information Technology, Matt Warthen, Michelle Crisp, and Joe Woodard. I'd like to provide you with an overview of this evening's event. First up, Dr. Tracy Weldon, Associate Dean of Diversity, Interdisciplinary Programs, and Social Sciences, will share some details about the remarkable life of Adrenée Glover Freeman. Dr. Emily Mann, Associate Director of Women's and Gender Studies, will introduce Sandra Rattley, Executive Producer of UNLADYLIKE 2020, our keynote speaker of the evening. We'll conclude with a Q&A session facilitated by Ms. Miranda Frederick. For tonight's event, we will be using the Q&A feature, so do feel free to submit your questions using that tool. With no further ado, I now introduce Dr. Tracy Weldon, Associate Dean for Diversity, Interdisciplinary Programs, and Social Sciences in the College of Arts and Sciences.
Thank you, Dr. Pfeffer, and good evening, everyone. On behalf of Dean Lacey Ford and the College of Arts and Sciences, I welcome you to the 27th Annual Freeman Lecture. Adrenée Glover Freeman was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, to Lily B. Jordan Glover and Captain Alton Glover. In 1955, the family moved to Columbia, South Carolina, where Freeman attended C.A. Johnson High School. She received her bachelor's degree in psychology from Duke University and her J.D. from the Law School of Rutgers University in Camden, New Jersey. She was appointed assistant to the executive director of the New Jersey Department of Treasury, Deputy Attorney General for the state of New Jersey, Assistant U.S. Attorney for the District of New Jersey, and Deputy Commissioner in the Department of Banking. She also served in other legal capacities before returning to Columbia in 1986. In Columbia, Freeman was active in many civic and legal activities. She served on the boards of directors for Helpline of the Midlands, Fair Share Housing Development, Respite House, and the USC Women's Studies Community Business Board. She was secretary of Victory Savings Bank and also served on the SCANA Columbia Regional Advisory Board. Freeman participated as an attorney advisor in the legal clinic for the YWCA Women's Resource Center and was a member of the Columbia chapter of Jack and Jill of America. She was a member of the South Carolina Bar, the South Carolina Lawyers Association, and the Columbia Lawyers Association. And in 2008, she was profiled in the AT&T South Carolina African American History Calendar, which honors notable African American achievers with ties to South Carolina. The Freeman Memorial Lecture Series was established in 1993 to commemorate the life and legacy of Adrenée Glover Freeman, who died unexpectedly on November 28, 1992, at the age of 42. Dr. Thaddeus Davis, professor of English at Brown University, delivered the first lecture in this series in 1994. Other speakers include U.S. women's track coach Curtis Fry in 2002 on the 30th anniversary of Title IX, Columbia City Councilwoman Tamika Isaac Devine in 2009, National Book Award winner for poetry and USC Professor Nikki Finney in 2013, National Book Award winner for poetry Claudia Rankin in 2015, and Professor Anita Hill, who delivered her first Freeman lecture in 2011 on the 20th anniversary of her U.S. Senate testimony, and again in 2016, the 25th anniversary of this historic event. Tonight, we are honored to have with us award-winning documentary executive producer Sandra Rattley, who will discuss her own professional journey and screen selected shorts on 3 African-American women trailblazers. Thank you for joining us this evening. We hope you'll enjoy the presentation. And now I'll turn it over to Dr. Emily Mann to introduce our speaker.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to introduce this year's speaker for the Freeman Lecture. Sandra Rattley has been an executive producer of path-breaking documentary projects, including the Peabody Award-winning series Wade in the Water on African American sacred music, produced with the Smithsonian Institution, and Making Music, hosted by Wynton Marsalis. She was also executive producer of the PBS Digital Studios series Read Awakening, and currently serves as executive producer for TV and video for Futuro Media, where she launched the PBS series America by the Numbers and CBS News's Humanizing America. She is the former vice president for cultural programming for NPR, where she launched the weekly show Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me, as well as NPR's Office of Civic Engagement. Rattley also serves as creative consultant for Black Public Media's 360 Incubator, a mentorship program for African American media makers. She has been a consultant for the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the Howard University Center for Urban Progress, and Brandeis University. She was a press spokesperson and member of the communications team for Nelson Mandela on his first US tour. And she is also a member of the Quander family, designated as one of the oldest documented African families in the United States, which traces its roots to Cape Coast, Ghana in West Africa. Please join me in welcoming Sandra Rattley.
It is a distinct honor to speak with you today, upholding the legacy of Ms. Adrenée Gwinnell Glover Freeman, Esquire, to honor her and women like her. We thank Ms. Freeman for her commitment to education and for all the leadership roles she held. We are grateful for her service on the Community Advisory Board of the Women's and Gender Studies program at the University of South Carolina. And I want to personally thank her family for establishing the Adrenée Glover Freeman Scholarship Fund and the Freeman Lecture in African American Women's Studies in her memory. And I am very grateful to have been chosen as your presenter for the 27th Annual Freeman Lecture. Because my presentation today includes 3 short films, I am intentionally keeping my comments about myself fairly limited. But I do want to share some personal details that were not part of Dr. Mann's introduction. I'm very proud of the fact that my mother's family, the Quanders, have been recognized as one of the, if not the, oldest documented African family in the United States. And that distinction is drawn from a will dated 1684 in which tobacco farmer Henry Adams in Charles County, Maryland, stated that his slaves Margaret and Henry Pug Quando should receive their manumission upon his death. My Quander family relatives were also numbered among the 317 slaves owned by the first family of the United States, George and Martha Washington at Mount Vernon. And my ancestor, Nancy Quander, is among 19 of those whose lives are examined in an exhibit titled Lives Bound Together, Slavery at George Washington's Mount Vernon, which will be open until July 2021. I often consider how being a descendant from a matrilineal culture, the Fanti language group in Cape Coast, Ghana, and evolving from a long line of strong women leaders have affected me and my life choices. I'm sure these antecedent narratives have affected my attraction and love for oral history, visual culture, journalism, and cultural production, as well as community organizing and justice. So I'm thrilled to participate in the semester 2020 theme of justice to contribute to the inquiry and conversation about justice that's taking place across the university. I'm going to extrapolate on the justice theme as my focus today is representational justice. You may ask, what does that mean? Representation is defined as the description or portrayal of someone or something, or the action of speaking or acting on behalf of someone. Representational justice asserts the rights of all people within society to be seen and heard, regardless of their status, optimally as they choose to represent themselves in first voice. I think this lens gives a fresh frame to plan and organize diversity work, and also the emancipatory power of media. The representational model of media has the strongest and broadest reach today, And that's through television, film, books, advertising, podcasts, social media, and other displayed forms of presentation and portrayals of people and communities. Media depictions in news and entertainment and other forms of popular culture play a very big role in shaping our perception of others. Entertainment and news media have created and perpetuated negative or positive assumptions and lasting perceptions. Thus, media representations have played a powerful role in codifying and valuing or denigrating and erasing cultural and racial narratives and identities in the 19th century. So my focus today on representational justice acknowledges the power of media designation. So media analysts agree that a number of groups have historically been underrepresented or absolutely absent from media representations that are prominent and common. So those groups include women, Blacks, Indigenous, and people of color, LGBTQA+ persons, people with diverse body shapes and images, people of non-Christian religions or beliefs, differently abled people, immigrants, those for whom English is a second language, those who are under-resourced, and those who live in rural areas or small towns, among others. Characters who play or portray members of these groups or people from these groups are often presented using formulaic tropes, cliches, or stereotypes. These are representations that we need to deconstruct and confront. I want to share some of images of dominant tropes, stereotypes, and cliches that have been used to characterize Black people, Black women in particular, in the 19th century. I don't want to trigger anyone. I realize that for many, these images may still be emotionally charged and may still be active in our collective psyche and community memory. These first images demonstrate how Black women have been locked in the domestic sphere through representation, the use of our bodies and our images for advertisement of popular food products. This first includes text, presumably what this Black woman would say about the white woman who is her overseer, when she says, "The missus won't have nothing else." The second image of Aunt Jemima was launched in 1889 and was just retired this year, 2020. That means this image has been an active part of our cultural landscape for 131 years. Nancy Green, a former slave from Kentucky, pictured in the next slide, became the advertising world's first living trademark, a mammy archetype named after a character in a minstrel show. The next slide shows stereotypical images of the first queen and last monarch of Hawaii. Her name is Liliuokalani. She was born in Hawaii and had very dark skin. When white businessmen, including Sanford Dole of Dole Fruit Company, wanted to take over the sovereign nation of Hawaii, they planted this imagery in mainstream US media. This image was published in 1892 in the San Francisco Examiner. As we see in the next slide, this misinformation and the promotion of the notion that a woman with a Black phenotype was unfit to lead a nation was part of their intent in the takeover of Hawaii, and ultimately led to the treason trial and house arrest of the Queen, and Hawaii ultimately becoming the 50th state of the United States in 1959. The minimization and erasure of the humanity of Black women is a direct correlate to Black women's forced labor and depictions and roles of servitude and domestication. As we see in the next slides, Black women picking cotton and sorting cotton, also doing laundry and textile work, and working as maids. Just 80 years ago, in 1940, 60% of all Black women in the US worked as maids. During and following World War II, Black women finally began to have more diversified paid work options, including factory work. These images are important to examine, to confront, to deconstruct, and contextualize. And also to remember that these images and the reality they document were active and in popular use Until very recently, these images have resulted, therefore, in lasting impacts and assumptions. During the same time period, in the 1800s and 1900s, the freedoms that were afforded all women were circumscribed and limited. We know that women did not get the right to vote until 100 years ago. In August 1920. Representational freedom for Black women came much later, in 1965, just over 50 years ago, with passage of the Voting Rights Act. But many may not know that 100 years ago, women were actually arrested for wearing pants in public. Here's a news clip about a woman who was fined in Louisiana and Livingston Parish for wearing, in quotes, knickers. And here's a news clip about Emma Snodgrass, who was arrested in New York and Boston for wearing pants. In this time period, the behavior and actions of women were very restricted. Women were expected to just get married, raise children, and maintain their households. And in their participation in public life or athletic activities was seriously prohibited, and in some cases even criminalized. For example, women were expected to climb mountains in petticoats, and many women fell into ravines trying to summit mountains in long Victorian skirts. But Annie Smith Peck, one of the first women to climb the Matterhorn, made history, not just because of that climb, but because she made herself a pair of pants to be able to complete her climb safely. Just as pseudoscientists and white supremacist thought leaders publish fake news as research supporting eugenics and other racist theories, similar research about women emerged in this time period, stating that women should not be allowed to attend college because higher education would render them infertile, or conversely, actually lead to insanity. Women could not own property, open a bank account, or have their own credit cards until October of 1974, when President Gerald Ford signed the Credit Card Act into law 46 years ago, and women began to have access to the basic tools of financial independence that had previously been the sole province of men. So what brings me here today, in addition to my focus on cultural imagery and representational justice, is a documentary film project I'm very proud of called UNLADYLIKE 2020, which is a model of representational justice. This project is missioned with making sure that diverse women and trailblazers who are women are represented and are seen, and that their stories are heard, and their accomplishments and exertions for the public good are part of the public record. My colleague Charlotte Mangan and I launched this project 4 years ago to make sure that the stories that are missing from the canon of history of women, and women of color in particular, who resisted societal expectations and limitations to create more freedom and democracy for all of us, are not erased from American history. For example, Ida B. Wells, Mary Church Terrell, and Sojourner Truth, or all my personal sheroes, are among the very first anti-racist pioneers in this country. Ida B. Wells is considered the first Black investigative journalist who investigated the claim that Black men who were lynched were rapists and criminals, as she uncovered in this book, Lynch Laws in All Its Phases. As you may know, although the term lynching typically referred to hanging, Black men, women, and children were also shot, burned, or dragged to death without the benefit of a fair trial, in acts of public torture staged to promote fear and maintain white supremacy. Many Americans may not know that also Indigenous Mexicans and Chinese immigrants were subjected to the same form of racial terror. Mary Church Terrell, also, as her friend Ida B. Wells did, wrote about and protested lynching, as she did in this article, Lynching from a Negro's Point of View. Terrell holds particular personal significance for me because although she was born in Memphis, Tennessee, she relocated to my hometown of Washington, D.C., where she excelled as an educator, an organizer, and an activist. We're going to find out more about Mary Church Terrell in this UNLADYLIKE 2020 documentary short about her life.
Church Terrell is central to all of the major movements of the late 19th and early 20th century. Suffrage, anti-lynching, and desegregation.
They say I don't act right, it's unladylike, how I wanna live my life.
1892, Memphis, Tennessee. 28-year-old Mary Church Terrell learned that her childhood friend had been killed by a lynch mob because his business was seen as competition by local whites.
The lynching of Thomas Moss is this turning point for Mary Church Terrell. His death is not just a symbol of racial violence, but also the ways that Black business owners were not shielded from the terrorizing of African Americans. So this fundamentally radicalizes her and how she's thinking about racial justice. And she's going to enter into the world of public activism.
Church Terrell and her journalist friend Ida B. Wells were among the first to speak out publicly against the thousands of lynchings that occurred at the turn of the century.
Hanging, shooting, and burning Black men, women, and children in the United States have become so common that such occurrences create little sensation. Tom Moss was murdered because he was succeeding too well. He was guilty of no crime but that.
Mary Church Terrell was born in Memphis, Tennessee in 1863. Her parents, both former slaves, were mixed race.
Mary Church Terrell comes from a very privileged and affluent background. Her father had made considerable money doing real estate and becomes one of, if not the first, African-American millionaire in the South. Also because this family is fair-skinned, they are able to have access to certain spaces that most peoples of African descent would not have had.
Church Terrell was one of the first African-American women to earn both a bachelor's and a master's degree when she graduated in 1888 from Oberlin College.
She's someone who's deeply invested in education, and teaching was the most common career pathway for African-American women and women more broadly who have completed college education. And so she takes her amazing talents to this new historically Black college, Wilberforce University, and teaches Latin there.
After studying in Europe for 2 years, Church Terrell moved to Washington, D.C. in 1890, where she taught at one of the first public high schools for African Americans. She soon married the chair of the language department, Harvard-educated Robert Terrell.
I enjoyed assisting him in the Latin department so much, I made up my mind to assist him in all departments for the rest of my natural life.
At first, she thinks about removing herself from public life because she's gotten married, which was an expectation for a lot of women. So for her to really galvanize around the pressing issues of the day and become a force in the founding of numerous organizations and campaigns that would ultimately reshape American history is quite phenomenal.
In 1892, Church Terrell and scholar Anna J. Cooper co-founded the Colored Women's League to address social problems facing the Black community.
It becomes a platform for her to think about the future of the race, one that's anchored in and created by and for Black women.
I am walking a path that Mary Church Terrell created. I would not be if it were not for her. This idea of combining the revolution of the classroom and the revolution of the streets had not really been done before her. I am Brittany Packnett. I'm an activist, an educator, and a writer, and obsessed with justice. It's impossible for me to care about education and not also care about housing. It's impossible for me to care about housing and not also care about employment and a living wage. It's impossible for me to care about a living wage and not care about someone's health care. police violence and racial justice, gender justice, all of these things are deeply interconnected. The truth of the matter is, I am committed to the belief that everyone can thrive.
In 1895, Church Terrell became one of the first African American women appointed to a school board in the country. Serving over a decade, she advocated for equal access to education in Washington, D.C.
More than once, my heart was saddened when some pupil would say, "Education will do us no good." There is nothing for colored people to do except hold menial positions, and we don't need an education for that.
2 months after the Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court decision upheld racial segregation in 1896, Church Terrell co-founded the National Association of Colored Women. Bringing together Black women's clubs from around the country, it advocated for reforms to improve African American life, including an end to segregation. She became its first president, coining the motto, "Lifting as we climb."
Lifting as we climb refers to continuing to climb out of the stereotypes about African Americans and specifically African American women that proliferated during this era, and lifting those communities most deeply affected by Jim Crow. This idea that these women who were educated and powerful could be the ones to really uplift those who did not have those resources.
The work we hope to accomplish can be done better, we believe, by the mothers, wives, daughters, and sisters of our race.
Mary Church Terrell saw voting rights as critical to the empowerment of African Americans. She sought support from white suffragists like Susan B. Anthony, whom she had met in the 1880s during her travels in Europe. She also picketed the White House with the white-led National Women's Party.
My sisters of the dominant race stand up, not only for the oppressed sex, but also for the oppressed race.
But her attempts to forge solidarity across racial lines were rebuffed. During one of the largest women's suffrage marches in 1913, like other Black suffragists, Church Terrell was forced to walk in the segregated section at the back.
Mary Church Terrell is there, marching with these young women from Howard University and being a part of this very historical moment, because it's only a few years after this march that the 19th Amendment is ratified. But she knows that Black women still don't have the status that white women do. So her activism around racial justice really intensifies.
Colored women are the only group in this country who have two heavy handicaps to overcome, that of race as well as that of sex.
As a founding member of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, Church Terrell traveled the country to speak out for civil rights. She never stopped her protests against lynching, helping to organize the 1922 Silent March to pressure Congress to pass anti-lynching legislation.
Not a band played, not a sound was heard. As I walked in silence up Pennsylvania Avenue, I thought of Tom Moss, who had been brutally lynched. And I said to myself, there is at least one person in this protest who understands personally exactly what it means.
No one is born woke. There's something wakes you up. And so for Mary Church Terrell, it was her friend being lynched. For an entire generation, it was seeing the photo of the open casket of Emmett Till. And one of my catalysts in life would be the death and the legacy of Michael Brown Jr. So there are certainly catalytic events that continue to wake people up, continue to energize people around justice. When I joined the Ferguson Commission and then later President Obama's policing task force, it was to help try and be a bridge. Because my responsibility is to make sure that my community is heard in the very places where decisions about our future are being made. And that idea of lifting as we climb is so powerful. It's to say there is no success if our people don't come along with us.
Church Terrell led sit-ins and protests well into her 80s. After being denied entry 3 times at a popular downtown restaurant, she filed a lawsuit that went to the Supreme Court. A year before her death in 1954, the court ruled to desegregate restaurants and stores in the nation's capital. As many as 200 anti-lynching laws have been introduced in Congress since 1900. The latest one, named for Emmett Till, is still being debated in 2020.
She was someone who had a vision of justice that was always concerned about the unique position of Black women within the framework of American democracy.
She recognizes the innate and immense power of Black women.
I cannot help wondering what I might have become and might have done if I had lived in a country which had not circumscribed and handicapped me on account of my race, but had allowed me to reach any heights I was able to attain.
They say I don't act right. It's unladylike how I wanna live my life.
While gender representation and gender freedom is increasingly being recognized as a right today, in the past, queer men and women paid a heavy price for any expression of agency, identity, or same-sex preference. For example, in 1953, Dwight D. Eisenhower, the president, signed an executive order banning gay men and women from working in any federal government agency, and this order remained in effect until 1975. As a result, as many as 425 people who were alleged to be gay were fired from the State Department. This executive order was also implemented in state and local government as well as private business, and gender nonconforming persons had to sign oaths of moral purity to keep their jobs. Beyond employment challenges, I don't think we can even imagine the legal vulnerability, religious pressure, and family rejection the gender nonconforming people experienced in very recent history, as they were often categorized as being criminally insane or morally depraved. But we're about to see the story of one audacious trailblazer who resisted all those restrictions to create a model for gender nonconformity in 1923. Let's watch the UNLADYLIKE 2020 short on trailblazer Gladys Bentley.
Gladys Bentley was an incredible talent on the piano and one of the few women at this time who was really boldly out and unashamed of her queer desires.
They say I don't act right. It's unladylike how I wanna live my life.
You're the Gladys Bentley. I thought your name sounded vaguely familiar.
1958, Los Angeles, California.
Well, what are you going to sing, Gladys?
I'm going to try to do Them There Eyes.
Them There Eyes.
Blues singer and pianist Gladys Bentley made her only television appearance on Groucho Marx's You Bet Your Life comedy show.
I loved you the first time I looked into them there eyes. Got a cute little way of flirting with them there eyes.
Gladys Bentley, the way that she presented herself was usually in a tux and a top hat, but she also had the makeup. She's always playing with identity and presentation and fluidity.
I have violated the accepted code of morals, but the world applauded my piano playing and song styling. Even though people bitterly condemned my personal way of living, they still could appreciate my artistry as a performer.
Yes, baby. Them there eyes.
Gladys Bentley was born in 1907 to a working-class family in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Her father was African American, her mother an immigrant from Trinidad.
It seems I was born different. At the age of 9, I stole my brother's suits and began to feel more comfortable in boys' clothes than in dresses.
Early on, she knew that she was attracted to women. She didn't feel like her body represented who she was.
Her parents are concerned about her budding lesbianism. They take her to doctors hoping to cure her, to make her a quote-unquote normal woman. We have the rise of medical experts who study the science of sex, who are introducing terms like homosexual and heterosexual. But most doctors at this time saw same-sex desire as pathological.
Some decide to take the reins of their destiny in their own hands. That is the way I reacted to being an unwanted child.
In 1923, at age 16, with dreams of becoming a musician, Bentley ran away from home to live in Harlem, New York, then the epicenter of the Harlem Renaissance.
It was a flowering time of African American arts, letters, cultural expression. When African Americans left the South with the Great Migration, they really create lives for themselves in places like New York, Chicago, Detroit, building these urban communities that were tolerant, that supported experimentation and different kinds of identities.
One of the reasons Harlem emerges as such a central site for queer African Americans at this time is because this is the Prohibition era. So from 1920 to 1933, it is illegal to purchase alcohol, but of course we have the emergence of speakeasies where people are able to purchase bootleg alcohol and take part in other illicit activities, from gambling to interracial dancing or same-sex dancing. So the entertainment industry becomes a really important alternative for Black women who really didn't have many other opportunities for work.
Bentley first worked on the Harlem party circuit. Then a job opened up at a nightclub.
The club was actually looking for a male piano player, but she insisted that this would be the perfect time for them to start using a female instead.
My hands flew over the keys.
I'll make you men folks treat us women like you do. I don't want no man that I got to give my money to.
When I finished my number, the applause was terrific. I was offered work right on the spot.
Bentley soon became a headliner at various clubs and theaters.
We have clubs such as the Ubangi Club, where Gladys Bentley performed, which are appealing more to explicitly queer audiences. We have what's known as the pansy craze going on, this interest in queer culture that white people had in this period.
Gladys Bentley sometimes was billed as a male impersonator, showing queerness and flirting with women on stage and singing songs with lyrics that are upsetting all the cultural norms about identity.
That big gorilla, a woman killer, and I ought to know.
Bentley's lyrics were known for their bold content, highlighting her cross-dressing tendencies and her feelings towards women.
She was not the only person who cross-dressed. Ethel Waters did it. Marlene Dietrich did it. Women, in their own ways, were challenging conceptions of what a woman could be.
So bad,
Gladys Bentley represents this lyrical and sexual prowess that women like me can wear on stage that is not ladylike.
Stage is gon' lean, so fresh, so clean. For them boys, the skirts, the butch, bald, and jeans.
My name is Charlotte Ammons.
Freak, convene. Sook like Charlotte, perfect connect like.
I am a musician, writer, and television producer.
I need to lose some sleep. I need the struggle, resistance, and the karmic relief.
Just knowing that Gladys existed and existed so proudly and so openly changed my life and completely gave me license to be all the things that I am. Black, Southern, queer, an artist. And so I started writing this record called Twilight for Gladys Bentley to reimagine Gladys in the body of a hip-hop artist.
Gladys, today I'm wearing
father. Tomorrow overalls for my aunts, my mama. Gladys used the popular music of her time to make a statement. I used the popular music of my time to make a parallel statement.
In 1928, Bentley began a recording career that would span 2 decades. She traveled to clubs all over the country and inspired characters in several books.
The clubs where I worked overflowed with celebrities. I had made my mark in show business.
But beyond the world of show business, Bentley's lifestyle faced criticism.
There was really no way that someone like her could be viewed as a respectable figure at this time. This is the Jim Crow era, right? There's such a concern about racial uplift, upward mobility, that a figure such as Bentley is seen as so deviant that many in the mainstream African-American community were not a fan, to put it mildly.
There were people such as Adam Clayton Powell or traditional mainline churches that had views of homosexuality that did not fit the tenets of Christian beliefs. And for many people, it was an aberration, something going against what God dictated. And so that backlash existed.
Bentley's act fell on hard times in the mid-1930s.
The Depression definitely made a difference in the entertainment world. And with the end of Prohibition, we actually see more regulation of nightclub spaces. There's a concern about bar spaces that are seen as disorderly, and disorderly was often a code word for gay at this time.
In 1937, Bentley moved to Los Angeles, California. But there, she faced challenges to her desire to perform on stage in men's clothing.
The state of California actually had anti-cross-dressing laws that went back to the 19th century to keep entertainment good and clean. And there were times where she was banned from performing because of her cross-dressing.
In the early 1950s, Bentley adapted her public image to match the times.
The post-World War II era becomes incredibly conservative, especially around norms of gender and sexuality. And this leads to what is known as not only the Red Scare, but also the Lavender Scare. And this kind of comes to a head with the firing of hundreds of government employees who are thought to be gay.
And possibly as a reaction to those times, she had to change her performance style to stay employed and to keep doing her line of work.
This is when we see her publish an article in Ebony magazine with the title, "I Am a Woman Again."
For many years, I inhabited that half-shadow, no man's land which exists between the boundaries of the two sexes. Today, I am a woman again, through the miracle of modern medicine, living a normal existence.
In that same article, Bentley stated that she consulted a doctor to receive hormone treatments and also married a man.
I think she's spinning a tale of respectability, right? A tale of someone who wants to be seen as fully human in this very repressive time.
If you read that article really closely, it really is a plea for tolerance and understanding. She's not condemning who she was or is, but really explaining the struggles of what it meant to live her life.
She went back into the closet so that one day I would never have to do that. Pacifist might laugh at this, might ask me if I'm a masochist given. But this is a white boy's game still. When you're making music that represents a marginalized history and the gatekeepers still don't look like you, that's something that a lot of musicians and artists who are Black or queer are constantly battling.
Bentley was studying to become an ordained Christian minister when she died of complications from a flu virus at age 52.
I see her as a pioneer. She's somebody we could all look up to, whether we're gay, lesbian, bi, heterosexual. She invited us to be our whole selves. And that's what we all want to be.
Red beans and rice, greasy bacon in the pot.
I have earned the distinction of being the first, and in some cases, the only performer of my race to crash the most plush glitter spots. I am still a star.
I have to represent and call the names of two Black women who fought for representational justice and established models for just, fair, and authentic reporting about the conditions and accomplishments of Black people. Anti-slavery activist Mary Carey started the provincial Freeman newspaper in 1853, and she became the first Black woman publisher in North America. And Boston journalist Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin founded The Woman's Era, the first national newspaper published entirely by and for Black women in 1894. The first Black women newspaper owners, publishers, and journalists were stalwart leaders in the abolition and suffrage movements, and were very effective human and civil rights activists, as demonstrated by our next heroine, renowned newspaper publisher Charlotta Spears Bass.
For the first time in the history of our nation, a political party has nominated a Negro woman for the second highest office in the land.
Charlotta Bass was so far ahead of her time running for vice presidency of this nation. And she used her newspaper to fight for rights across the spectrum.
They say I don't act right, it's unladylike, how I wanna live my life.
1912, Los Angeles, California. 24-year-old Charlotta Bass worked at the California Eagle, one of the first African-American newspapers in the state.
She found her way to that newspaper selling subscriptions. The California Eagle was founded by J.J. Nemore in 1879 to support the movement for equality among African Americans.
In 1912, Nemore called Bass to his deathbed.
It was Charlotta that he asked to carry the paper on after his passing, and she made a deathbed promise to him that she would.
Almost overnight, I became owner, editor, and publisher. Who had ever heard of a woman running a newspaper? It was the talk of the town.
Although there's some debate about the year and location, Bass was born Charlotta Amanda Spears in 1888 in Little Compton, Rhode Island. She attended desegregated public schools in Providence and worked selling ads and subscriptions for a Black newspaper, the Providence Watchman.
In the white mainstream newspapers, African Americans were mentioned almost exclusively in stories about crime. That was it. So the Black press provides coverage impossible to find in the mainstream press.
In 1906, Bass moved to Los Angeles, a city booming with the promise of jobs.
Negroes were in search of dignity and civil rights. It was the dawn of a new life in an atmosphere of freedom.
Everybody came to California, starting in the late 19th century. And African Americans were part of those migrations. On the one hand, that period was defined by violence against Black people, the rise of white mobs, lynching, and all kinds of terror. At the same time, this was actually a kind of golden age for African Americans. They were building institutions, publishing newspapers, developing a culture, and flourishing in many ways.
When Bass became one of the first African American women to own a newspaper in 1912, her first order of business was keeping the doors open.
It was an extraordinary thing for anyone to own a newspaper because of the kind of resources that it took to run the presses and to pay the bills and to just get the newspaper distributed.
Bass hired a veteran reporter as her second in command.
Joseph Bass was an experienced newspaper man. He'd been an editor on an African-American newspaper in Kansas before he migrated to California. Charlotta kept the title of managing editor, and Joseph Bass took care of internal workings of the paper.
They married in 1914. Under their joint leadership, the California Eagle grew from a 4-page tabloid to a 20-page weekly with the largest circulation of any African-American paper on the West Coast.
Every issue that people were facing, whether it was in the schools, in the job market, in housing, not being served in a restaurant, all were reflected in the pages of the California Eagle.
The paper dedicated itself to the task of waging bloodless but fearless war against segregation and discrimination wherever they raised their ugly heads.
The role the Black press has always had to play is to take Black people from being invisible and to try to push the country through our reporting to be more democratic. My name is Nicole Hannah-Jones, and I'm a staff writer at the New York Times Magazine. I got my first letter to the editor published when I was in middle school. I read a column I thought was racist, and I wrote a letter to the newspaper complaining. And I never forgot how empowering that felt to actually see my name in print. So the only reason I ever wanted to be a journalist was to write about racial inequality. I've done that with housing segregation, with school segregation, and the 1619 Project, which I created to commemorate the 400th anniversary of the first Africans being sold into the United States. Every single story in the magazine starts with America today and shows how these things about American life that you think are unrelated to slavery actually are. It was an effort to show that virtually nothing has been left untouched by the legacy of slavery and the American story. We were founded not as a democracy, but as a slaveocracy. I earned the Pulitzer Prize for my opening essay, which is on how Black Americans are the perfecters of democracy.
Charlotta Bass took a lot of risks in the work that she did. Southern California was one of the main fields where the Klan was recruiting, and she called them out on a regular basis in the pages of the newspaper. And she suffered a campaign of harassment and threats.
One night in 1925, Bass was working alone when 8 hooded members of the Ku Klux Klan showed up at the paper's offices.
She pulled a pistol out of the drawer of her desk and pointed at them.
I had never handled a gun before and wasn't quite sure which end to point at the intruders, but they evidently thought I might know how to shoot, and all 8 beat a hasty retreat.
Her husband told her, "You're going to get me killed one day, Mrs. Bass." And she always told him, "Well, Mr. Bass, it will be in a good cause."
After Joseph Bass died in 1934, Charlotte Bass ran the newspaper by herself for another 2 decades and became more involved in electoral politics.
She joined committees, she marched on picket lines, she lectured, she ran for city council, she ran for county office.
In the 1930s and 40s, Bass helped win a series of victories for equal rights, including ending employment discrimination at various LA companies.
Black people, and particularly Black women, are still vastly underrepresented in mainstream newsrooms. And that is why I helped co-found the Ida B. Wells Society for Investigative Reporting to do away with that one excuse that we hear all the time, which is we'd love to hire more Black investigative reporters. We just can't find any who are qualified. We've trained hundreds of journalists in the skills of investigative reporting. If we are not presenting our own communities, then other people will shape the way that our stories get told, what doesn't get told, and how the larger world sees us.
After being a member of the Republican Party for 30 years, Bass was frustrated by its lack of progress on civil rights. In 1948, she became one of the founders of a left-wing third party dedicated to ending segregation and protesting President Truman's Cold War policies. Bass ran for Congress in 1950 on the Progressive Party ticket. She lost, but didn't stop there.
In 1952, she actually ran for the office of the Vice Presidency of the United States with Vincent Hallinan on the Progressive Party ticket. There wasn't a chance in hell that they were going to win, much less get a lot of votes. But she took every opportunity she could to have her voice heard and to bring the kind of social justice that she thought was needed.
It is with great pride that I come before the American people at this moment. For the first time in the history of our nation, a political party has nominated a Negro woman for the second highest office in the land.
Bass was labeled a radical. The federal government investigated her as a potential communist. The post office tried to revoke her postage permit for the California Eagle. She sold the paper in 1951, and it continued publication until 1964.
I am very confident that within my lifetime, I will see first-class citizenship achieved for all my people, true democracy for all Americans.
She's really been erased from national memory.
In her 70s, Bass transformed the garage of her home into a community reading room and voter registration site. Living long enough to witness the legislative victories of the civil rights movement, Bass died in 1969. She was 81.
What most inspires me about Charlotta Bass is her fearlessness. She had such a sense of obligation, not just to her own people, but to justice. I think she certainly helped create a path for someone like myself to exist.
I believe in a world of good. The battle is not won nor the struggle past, but I know the future will be even better.
They say I don't act right, it's unladylike, how I wanna live my life.
There's considerable lack of consensus about where Charlotta Spears Bass was born. Most references cite her place of birth as Sumter, South Carolina, around 1880 to parents Kate and Hiram Spears. But we at UNLADYLIKE decided to review and reference Bass's personal papers, her handwritten and typed notes that are archived at the Southern California Library, and which you can see one page of here, where Spears Bass says she was born in Little Compton, Rhode Island. One of the first criteria of authentic representation is first voice. So we accepted that Charlotta Spears Bass is the preeminent source of information about herself, which is why we reported what Bass wrote in her own words, that she was born in Rhode Island. In closing, I want to reflect on representational disparities and propose some ideas for you to think about to help promote representational justice in your work. The Smithsonian Institution's National Women's History Museum completed research on the social studies standards K through 12 taught in every state in the United States. And in that research documented that out of 737 historical figures that show up in each state's curriculum, just 178 are women, including some fictional characters, Molly Pitcher and Rosie the Riveter, Of the 178 women named in state standards, the majority, 55%, received just one mention, and only 15 women are named more than 10 times, or in at least 10 states. It's interesting to note that the woman with the most mentions in all states, and is therefore the most taught in American history, is civil rights icon Rosa Parks. Also of note, roughly 5,200 public statues and monuments that are on display throughout the United States that depict historic figures. Of them, only 394 are women, and none of the 44 memorials maintained by the United States Park Service focus on women. So this translates to women constituting less than 24% of the persons deemed to be of historic significance who are taught in American history. And women's lives or achievements are represented in only 7.5% of all monuments, sculptures, and public art in this country. Scholar Myra Sadker, whose close to 20 research projects documented gender bias in American education, stated, "Each time a girl opens a book and finds a womanless history, she learns she is worthless." But I would argue that these absences, these erasures, have grave and lasting impact on us all, on boys as well as girls, and on men and women. And as you can well imagine, these percentages are even more stark when we examine the representations or lack thereof of women of color. While producing UNLADYLIKE 2020, we became very aware that there is a chronic lack of evidentiary material available about women of accomplishment who are of color. We started with a list of over 200 women, all worth documenting, but in too many instances, we could not tell their stories because the source material is just not available to support an investigation of their lives, regardless of their accomplishments and acts of valor. That is why we created educational curriculum focused on the 26 women we have featured to date in UNLADYLIKE 2020. So their stories can have an afterlife in the classroom, and hopefully their legacies will continue to inspire future generations. As we examine whose narratives are valued and whose lives and stories are valorized and memorialized in statues and other lasting tributes, I ask you to please consider the lens of representational justice as you choose your focus of study and research. That you consider what you can do to address deficits in information, image, and representation. Consider what voices are missing and what voices need to be elevated. Which underrepresented groups, including women, Blacks, Indigenous people of color, LGBTQA+ persons, people with diverse body images, people of non-Christian beliefs, differently abled people, immigrants, people for whom English is a second language, those who are under-resourced, who live in rural areas or small towns, among others. Which of these groups should you need to give space to? In addition, please endeavor to include multiple points of view in your research and study, and not just select topics of focus based solely on identity criteria. Let's include the voices and views of innovators and those emerging with new theories and new thinking, as well as those who uphold legacy traditions. It is important as researchers, storytellers, and history keepers that we find space within the academy for disparate points of view and perspectives to coexist. As we imagine what a just representative future looks like, in which all people are present and accounted for, seen and heard, and we commit to helping to make it a reality, let us consider the curative and redemptive steps we should advance and work on in our own spaces, in our own areas of creation, research, and study to get there, so that our cumulative efforts will result in real change. Thank you for your time today. My thanks to Tracy Weldon, Associate Dean for Diversity, Interdisciplinary Programs, and Social Sciences for her warm welcome, to Dr. Emily Mann, Associate Director of the Women's and Gender Studies Program, for her generous introduction. It has been a true pleasure working with Dr. Carla Pfeiffer and Miranda Frederick of the Women's and Gender Studies Program. Special thanks to Matt Wortham, production manager of the university's Division of IT, for patiently managing the technology for tonight. Thanks also to my colleague, Alice Quinlan, UNLADYLIKE 2020's Impact Logistics producer, for her management of the details for tonight. Please take note of this information on this final slide so you can find out more information about UNLADYLIKE 2020. And thanks to you all for watching and for being with me tonight. Thank you for your questions and comments and for participating in this Zoom gathering and for being part of the 27th Annual Freeman Lecture in African American Women's Studies at the University of South Carolina. We are grateful to the family and the legacy of Ms. Adrenée Gwinnell Glover Freeman, Esquire. We are grateful for her life. May we continue to learn from her example and be inspired by her sense of community and excellence. Thank you.
On behalf of the Women's and Gender Studies program, we hope you enjoyed this presentation by Sandra Rattley, 2020 Freeman Lecturer. I hope you enjoyed the opportunity to get to learn more about this group of trailblazing women: Mary Church Terrell, Gladys Bentley, Charlotta Spears Bass, and Sandra Rattley herself. We're so sorry that we couldn't bring this content to you live due to technical difficulties, but during these strange times, we adapt, and adapt we will. If you'd like to learn more about UNLADYLIKE 2020, please visit unladylike2020.com.